Nearly 50 years ago, on October 30th, 1974, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman squared off in a boxing ring in Zaire. Ali had dubbed it the Rumble in the Jungle. Foreman was heavily favored and was considered to be one of the hardest punchers in heavyweight history. Foreman was fairly confident that he could finish off this upstart show-off. And when he entered the ring, he intended to do everything in his power to squash him. Ali, however, did something in that fight that no other fighter has ever tried before. In a technique he called the rope-a-dope, Muhammad Ali held up his arms against his face and leaned back against the ropes, allowing Foreman to punch away at him for 8 rounds. The strongest boxer in history of sports beat on Ali until he could not punch no more. When the right moment came, Ali bounced off the ropes and knocked out Foreman, sending him into retirement. George Foreman believed in himself. He was a confident boxer who delivered the hardest, most powerful blow of any pugilist that had ever fought in the ring. And yet, he lost. And not only did he lose, he suffered a blow in the ring from which he never quite recovered. This fight literally sent him into retirement. 2,000 years ago, there was another confident man, a fighter, a brute of a man who feared nothing or no one. And if there was a conflict, you could count on him being there, especially if the conflict endangered his friends, and especially if that friend happened to be Jesus Christ. His name was Peter, or Petros. People of the day might have called him Rocky, for that's what his name meant. And like his name, he was a rock of loyalty and of courage and strength. A man who had decided to stand beside Jesus in the worst of situations. And for the most part, Peter did stand beside Jesus. His loyalty to Christ caused him to be a model of true faith and devotion. It was Peter who stepped out of the boat and walked on water out to Jesus. Now, say what you will about the fact that he took his eyes off of Jesus and began to watch the waves and feel the violent wind. He took his eyes off of Jesus and became overwhelmed by fear and doubt and began to seek. Then Jesus reached down to him and rebuked him for his lack of faith. Say what you will about that incident, but Peter was the only one of the 12 who even dared to try it, because he loved and trusted Jesus and wanted to be with his master even in the most impossible of situations. It was Peter who answered Jesus' question when he asked who the disciples said he was. Peter blurted out, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Some might say, well, yeah, but a few minutes later, he said something really embarrassing that caused Jesus to rebuke him. True. was something to do, something to say, something to stand for, Peter was there. You could count on him. Peter was a simple, uncomplicated man who had one driven passion: his love for Jesus and his determination to defend his master against all threats. That's why he reacted so violently to Jesus' comments in Matthew 16:21 through 23. Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus returned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man." And later, at Mark 16:27 through 31, when Jesus is about to be betrayed by Judas in the garden, he says, "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. Then here in Luke, we read that Peter told Jesus, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." That's the kind of friend I want to have. There aren't many who, when the going gets tough and your back is against the wall, who stands there for you. There's many times I wish I had a guy like Peter watching my back. Peter was willing to step into the ring and take on all comers for the sake of Jesus. And I believe he would have tried to take on the entire Roman army if it came down to it. Even now, Peter believes he could defend Jesus against any threat, but he wasn't going to be able to. You see, Jesus knew something about that coming fight that Peter didn't. Peter was going to try to fight a fight that he could not win. Look at Luke 22:31 and 32. "Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your own faith will not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." In other words, Peter, you're not going to win this one. You will turn away. You will fail. Your faith will falter. You're going to hit the mat and hit it hard. But I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that you don't stay down for the full count. And when you get back up, I'm going to pray for you to strengthen the others. Now, the fact that Jesus had warned Peter he would fail didn't stop Peter from trying. You remember in the garden when Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Remember the man cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest? That was Peter. John 18:10 tells us Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And even after Jesus was arrested, Peter still doesn't give up. Luke 22:54 tells us that when the crowd seized Jesus, then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. He's upset. He's frustrated. And he perhaps a little fearful that this whole thing has gotten way out of hand. But he was still seeking the opportunity to protect his master. He was still hoping to defend Jesus, even if he didn't want to be defended. He follows, trying to stay close to Jesus, hoping to, well, we don't know what he hoped. We don't know what he planned, or even if he had a plan. All we know is he sat down by the fire and he waited for his chance to do something. The Gospel of Mark gives us this account. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denies it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Peter denied Jesus. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Just like Jesus said he would. 3 times Peter said, "I don't know this Jesus." He even cussed a little to prove that he wasn't one of Christ's followers. But why? Why would Peter deny this Jesus he was so devoted to? We're not told. But in my personal suspicion is that Peter feared that if he was recognized, then he would be arrested. And if they arrested him, he couldn't do Jesus any good whatsoever. His usefulness to Jesus would end here in the courtyard. So he lied. He cursed. And he denied even knowing Jesus. Doing everything humanly possible to be of use to Jesus. Then when he heard the cock crow and saw Jesus look directly at him, he went out and wept bitterly. He had done everything he knew how to do to protect Jesus. And in the end, he failed. Now, there are 2 things I want you to see here. First, Peter lost this fight and betrayed his master for one very basic reason. He wanted to protect Jesus, but he wanted to do it in his way. Even when Jesus told him how things were going to turn out, Peter refused to accept it. He even had the audacity to rebuke Jesus when Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter's plan was to improve on God's plans by doing what came naturally to him: violence and anger. Later, when the crowd came to the garden to arrest Jesus, Peter acted true to his form. He took out his sword and started swinging, cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest. The way Peter got it figured, if you hurt Jesus, Peter intended on hurting you. And Peter wasn't the only one that thought like this. Luke 9 tells us the story of James and John, who were outraged when the Samaritan city rejected Jesus. James and John then asked Jesus to bring down fire out of heaven and destroy the town. But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You know not what manner of spirit you are of." You see, the problem for James and John, and for Peter as well, was that they forget who they were. They forgot who they belonged to. They forgot that this wasn't how Jesus did things. They were used to the idea that if someone hurt their Jesus, they were going to hurt them. And are we any different? If someone attacks Jesus, attacks our faith, attacks our church, don't we get angry and almost violent? I don't know about you, but I've been that way. But we are called to be different. Called to a different way of dealing with this world. Because we belong to Jesus Christ. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5, though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretensions that set itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Why do we fight different than the world does? Because our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authority, against the power of this dark world, and against the spiritual force of evil in the heavenly realm. The reason Peter lost his fight that day was that he forgot who he belonged to. And he tried to fight the battle his own way, doing everything humanly possible to defend Christ, rather than doing that which is divinely required. That's why he failed. And that's the first thing I want you to see. Second, in spite of the fact that Peter failed Jesus, his failure wasn't permanent. I believe Peter nearly gave up on following Jesus after that fateful night. I believe he had determined that Jesus could never trust him again. There's even a possibility that after Jesus came from the dead, that Peter had intended to go back to fishing again, rather than embarrass Jesus ever again as he did at that night at the fire. Part of the reason I believe that it's found in John 21, where we're told Peter's sitting at another campfire with Jesus. At the other campfire in the high priest's courtyard, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Now, at this campfire, Jesus gives Peter 3 chances to tell him that he loves Christ. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" And he's using the word agape, or love. "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Peter uses phileo. Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." At the first campfire, Peter had failed Jesus because he tried to do things his own way, using his own plans and his own strength. That might happen to you and me as well. There may become a time when we'll fail Jesus, just like Peter did. We'll embarrass God so badly, we won't think He'll ever forgive us again. That's when we need to realize that He forgave Peter. And that means He can forgive us too. Gary Enright, in his book, Hearts of Iron, Feet of Clay, tells the story of a very capable evangelist that God had used in a significant way in the British Isles. But he lost his interest in the spiritual things and drifted into a life of sin for a number of months. Some of his sins were done in secret, but ultimately it became public knowledge and even made the headlines. At first, all he could think of was that he had been ruined for life. But finally, he realized what a fool he had been. And he came back to God. And like the prodigal from the pig pen, when he did that, he found exactly the same thing the prodigal did. The Lord welcomed him with open arms and began to strengthen and bless him. Finally, after a period of waiting, he felt pressed back into the public ministry. He was afraid that his sins would be found out and brought up all over again. But after he felt sure it was hidden and tucked away in the past, he went back to preaching, rejoicing in the forgiveness of God. One night, when he was in Aberdeen, he was given a sealed letter just before the service began. He read the unsigned letter. It described a shameful series of events he had been engaged in. His stomach churned as he read it. The letter said, "If you have the gall to preach tonight, I'll stand and expose you." He took the letter and went to his knees for a few minutes. Later on, he was in the pulpit, and he began his message by reading that letter from start to finish. Then he said, "I want to make it clear that this letter is perfectly true. I'm ashamed of what I've read and what I've done. I come tonight not as one who is perfect, but as one who is forgiven. God used that letter in the rest of his ministry as a magnet to draw people to Christ. May you grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.